Okay, I've started recording. Are there any questions before we get started? Okay. It's, somebody say something so I get confirmation that you're actually hearing me.
We can
Hello.
hear you.
We can
Okay,
hear you.
great, thank you.
Yeah.
It's just disturbing when you start wondering, are people actually hearing me? Okay, and now let's share. All right, so you should be seeing a page on rent controls. We last time we said that in chapter 8 we were talking about price controls, and you want to think of this in very general terms, because there are really price controls applies to situations that you probably don't think of as being a price control situation. Remember, a price control simply means the government is intervening in how prices are set. And we have two main types of price controls: a price ceiling and a price floor. Price ceiling is where the government says there's a maximum price that firms can charge. Ceiling is where they say there is a floor, is where they say there's a minimum price that firms can charge. And we said that we went through the various consequences that will result when you have a price ceiling, such as you'll have shortages, you have the quality of the product tends to go down. Several other things we listed. These are things that we're not just saying that sometimes this might happen. We're saying that there are very good reasons to believe that when we impose a ceiling, we keep the price below the level that it would otherwise be at, we should expect these things to happen. We should be surprised if they don't happen. It's often controls are put into place and people are surprised when these very predictable things happen. We also said that one example of a price ceiling that is often used is rent control, where the price that landlords can charge for apartment rent is fixed by the government. We pointed out that the long run supply curve is a lot more elastic than the short run supply curve. And that wouldn't have meant anything to you prior to chapter 5, but now you know elasticity represents sensitivity to a price change. And so when we say that the long run, or when we say the short run supply curve is not very elastic, it means that when the rent is lowered in the short run, it's not going to have much effect on the quantity that will be supplied. But because the long run supply curve is much more elastic, then when the controlled rent is imposed, that will have a much bigger effect on the quantity supplied over time, with the result that when the rent control is imposed, you do get a shortage, and the shortage is going to grow over time. It's going to get worse because fewer new apartment units are built. Older units are turned into condominiums, and units are torn down to make way for other uses. To understand the effect of price controls, you have to learn to think from the perspective of the consumer, which isn't hard for most of us, but also from the perspective of the producer. And when the producer, in this case, the owner of the apartment unit, is told, we're going to make you charge less, think about how the producer responds to that. The producer's thought is, how can I get around this control? Maybe he was charging $2,000 a month before. Now he's told he can charge maybe only $1,500. Okay. He doesn't just say, oh, okay. He thinks, how can I get around this? What can I do so that my profit doesn't get reduced as much as it was going to be reduced? And one of the ways is older units are turned into condominiums. What's a condominium? If you own a condominium, what does that mean? If you're living in a condominium, that means that you're living in this unit, but you own it. If it belongs to you, you own it. So you're not renting it to anybody else. So you could have an apartment complex where it's owned by one person or one business, and they're renting out to the separate tenants. When rent control is imposed, that means that the rent that can be charged to each tenant is now going to be less than before. Well, one way the owner of the complex can get around this restriction is to say, well, I'm going to turn my units into condominiums, which means rather than continuing to own the complex, he's going to take each unit and he's going to sell it to someone. So if you might be living in this unit and you're paying, let's say you're in California where the rents are rather high, you were paying $2,000 a month. You didn't like that. You hear the rent's going down to $1,500. You think, oh, this is great. I'm going to have all this extra money. And then you get a notification from your landlord saying, good news, we're going to give you the opportunity to purchase your own unit. So you won't have to pay us any rent anymore. You will own your own unit. And for only, maybe $200,000, $250,000, you can own your own unit. And if you choose not to purchase your unit as a condominium, then, well, you have 60 days to get out and find another place to stay. You might say, I don't have the money to purchase my unit. Well, that's too bad. The landlord has the right, it's his property, so he can choose to turn it into a condominium if he wants to. And that means you're going to be out on the street and you have to now find another place to live during a period in which there's going to be a shortage of housing. So, that's just one example of a way that people who are renting can very seriously be hurt by rent control, because their units can be converted into a condominium. When I remember when I was in Santa Monica, there was and I was looking for an apartment, and there was one apartment complex that was advertising, and it seemed like it was a really good rent they were offering, and it was easy to get into it. I thought, this seems kind of suspicious, and looked into it and found out that they were planning to turn it into a condominium in the near future. So yes, it was easy to get into it, but I wouldn't be able to stay there for very long. Okay. And here was our graph dealing with that. You see the relatively inelastic supply curve showing that when the rent was up here, when the rent control is imposed, so the rent is reduced, we saw that in the short run supply and demand would be relevant. So in the short run, because the rent is lower, quantity demanded is going to be greater, okay? Because partially because people who were sharing apartments before, now they want their own apartment because it's cheaper. So quantity demanded is going to be greater. Quantity supplied, notice, goes down a little bit initially. The landlords don't have very good options in the short run. So the quantity supply doesn't go down too much, but you do have a shortage that occurs immediately when the ceiling is imposed. But then over time, quantity supply is going to respond more, and it's going to respond in a way that is not good for consumers. Keeping the rent at the new controlled level, quantity supply was here. Over time, we don't know how long the long run is here, say maybe it's 2 years or 3 years, then the quantity that will be available is going to go down, which means the shortage which was this amount, this area, becomes the much bigger area. Okay? That is an important thing to notice about rent control and other price ceilings. They create shortages, which will be relatively small at first, but over time, they get bigger and bigger. When we allow the price mechanism to work, then if there is a shock to a market, it may produce a big jump in the price, but then over time, things will tend to go back closer to the normal situation. But that is not the case with price controls. They create a problem initially, and then the problem doesn't get better over time. The problem gets worse over time as the producers find more and more ways to avoid the restriction that the government is putting on them. And we shouldn't be surprised by that, because fundamentally, remember, when you have a price control, the government is causing the price to communicate the wrong information. And the longer the period of time that passes, the more decisions will be made based on the wrong information. And so those are bad decisions. Producers are making decisions that are good for them, okay, given the wrong price. The producer he's making a good decision from his perspective when he converts to condominiums, or when he lets his property decline in quality. It's a good decision from his point of view, because it's not profitable to maintain his property, and it's not profitable to rebuild it when it gets older. Okay, it's not good for society, because people who desperately want housing aren't able to get it, and the value they place on housing would be communicated to the producer, and he would respond if the price were allowed to go up. But when you keep the price down, you are preventing that information from being signaled to producers. There's a great picture in the textbook of someone setting off a torch, a signal flare, to attract attention, and that's what prices do. They signal the information about the value of resources. They get producers' attention, and they give producers an incentive to respond to it. So price controls are like causing those signals, those flares, to not work, or to send the wrong message. Send the message of everything's okay. You don't need to respond. All right. So shortages caused by rent controls, which is correct, they become more severe over time. Okay, a lot of things, most things in an unconstrained market, you have a problem, and then they will get better over time as people are adjusting. But when you have rent control or other types of price controls, the problems get worse over time. Rent controls reduce housing quality. Why? Because owners, they're looking for ways to get around the restrictions. And they were, before the control, they were providing housing of a certain quality, and they were charging a price that matched that quality. If the government says we're not going to charge you, or we're not going to allow you to charge the same price, then the producers in effect say, okay, well, if we have to charge a lower price, then we're not going to provide as high a quality product. We're going to let the quality go down. We're not going to maintain the quality at the existing level. And when rent controls are strong, apartment buildings turn into slums. Meant to look for a picture of a part of New York City where it literally looked like it had been bombed. Looked like planes had come and just totally destroyed the city. But that hadn't happened. The only thing that had happened was that they had rent control. And so the landlords allowed the property to just totally fall apart, and it was literally worthless. It's been said that the most effective way to destroy a city, apart from bombing it, is rent control. And we have lots and lots of examples of how that is true. Okay. When you have rent control, finding an apartment often involves a costly search. I mentioned last time that if vacant houses or vacant housing is advertised in the paper, well, it doesn't do very much good to go check those out, because people are having trouble finding housing. So by the time it's in the paper, it will already have been rented. So you just drive down the street and look for signs that say vacant, and as soon as you find one, you go in and try to rent it and hope someone else hasn't beat you to it. I saw in your textbook, talks about in New York City that sometimes people will read the obituaries to see who, not because they care who died, but they want to see who died. They want to find out where that person lived, and then try to be the first person to get to the landlord to say, I want to rent that apartment. Okay, it seems kind of bizarre, but those are the kinds of things, kind of unanticipated, unintended things that happens when you interfere with the price mechanism. Also, another thing that is very unanticipated. At control prices, landlords have more renters than apartments, so they can discriminate. If the rent is not controlled, then at the equilibrium price, the landlord has an incentive to be responsive when consumers come and want to live in his apartment. Generally, if we're in equilibrium, there are going to be some apartments that aren't filled at any given point in time. And he wants to get those filled quickly, so he'll be earning more rent. So if without rent control, if someone comes and says, I'd like to rent this apartment, and if for some reason he doesn't like them, okay, there's something about them he doesn't like, if he turns them down, it's going to cost him money, because it means that his apartment is going to stay vacant for longer. Whereas with rent control, there's a huge shortage. And a shortage means that there are lots of people competing to get each landlord's apartments. So as soon as a landlord has an opening, people are going to be lining up trying to get that unit. So if you're a landlord and you have one unit to rent, and you got 10 people who have applied today for that unit, what does it cost you to discriminate and rent it out to person you like and not rent it out to somebody else that there's something about them that you don't like? Okay? If you've got one apartment and 10 people who want it, then you can discriminate without bearing any cost. So we would expect that when you have rent control, that is going to lead to greater discrimination, and that has been studied and in a number of different situations, and that is a conclusion that has been confirmed, that when you have a controlled price, it does tend to lead to more discrimination than you would otherwise have. Also, we mentioned about bribes. Bribes are illegal, but remember, in a rent control situation, there's a shortage. So put yourself in the position of the consumer. Let's say you have a family. You have to find a place for your family to live. And you see these new apartments becoming vacant, but as soon as they become vacant, somebody takes them. So how do you find a place for your family to live? You're competing by trying to get to the new vacancies before anybody else. But another way to compete would be to offer the landlord a bribe and say, if you rent to me rather than somebody else, as soon as you have a vacancy, you let me know, okay? I'll pay you $100. I'll pay you $200. I'll give you a bribe so that you give it to me rather than to somebody else. That would be illegal, but you would have an incentive to do that. Okay? I'm not saying that it would be right to do. Okay? We're talking about what people have an incentive to do. And under these situations, people trying to get an apartment have an incentive to offer bribes to the landlord. Okay? And bribes can be disguised. They can have, the landlord can have a policy of, well, if you before you take possession of this apartment, you have to put down a deposit for a key, okay? Because you might not return the key at the end. Now, it's possible that they are really concerned that you won't return the key at the end of your lease, or it's possible that this is just a disguised bribe. If they're not planning to ever give you that key money back, but by charging $500 or $1,000 for quote key money, the landlord is getting more money from you than the rent control policy is intending to allow. Also, they will get around the rent control policies by charging for a furnished apartment. I love this picture. You see here's an apartment. It doesn't look very furnished. It does have a folding chair there. Okay? So they have the pretense of it being a furnished apartment, and they can charge you more because it's furnished, or they could say that do something called a tie-in sale. They can say, if you want to rent this apartment, then you have to also buy the furniture. And the rent control policy limits what they can charge you per month. But unless the policy explicitly outlaws some kind of a tie-in sale, then they can say, okay, yeah, we'll rent you the unit for the rent control price, but you're going to have to buy the furnishings here for $1,000. You look and you see, well, that's just a folding chair. The folding chair is not worth $1,000 to you. But by having the tie-in, they're able to charge you more for that chair than it's really worth. You're getting a really bad deal on the chair, but that's a way that you can encourage the landlord to allow you to rent the apartment rather than somebody else. Okay? And you might think, well, how would they think up schemes like this? If you're the owner of that property and you have spent thousands of dollars building that property, and now the government says, well, we're not going to let you charge as much as you thought you could charge, you have a big incentive to spend a lot of time thinking about, how do I deal with this? How do I respond to this? And landlords sometimes become very, very creative in finding ways to get around the controls. So the politicians who create the policy, they don't have that much incentive to really think through how this is going to work. But the owners of the property do. And the owners are going to respond in ways that will benefit them and lead to unanticipated consequences. Other effects of rent control apartments are not allocated to the renters who value them the most. Who gets the apartment is really kind of arbitrary. Also from when I was in California under rent control, I had a friend who lived in a 2-bedroom apartment up on a pretty high hill, had a great view. It was located in a really good part of town. He wasn't all that rich. Well, he wasn't rich at all, actually. And he lived by himself. Why did he have a 2-bedroom apartment? Well, he had a 2-bedroom apartment because at some point, several years in the past, someone he was related to or he was friends with had rented that apartment, and they had continued to hold the lease on that apartment. And so since this had been a long period of time, and since the landlord was only allowed to raise the rent when a new renter took over, okay, the rent was at a very, very low level. It was a huge bargain. And his friend allowed him to live there. The lease wasn't in his name, but because he had a friend who did have this very valuable apartment, he got to live there. His friend was doing him a big favor, or his friend could have charged him a lot of money if he had wanted to do that. Now, what I want you to see here is that was very inefficient. He lived in this big apartment, 2 big bedrooms. He didn't need all that space. But the cost to him of having that big apartment was very low. Now, if there had not been any rent control, the rent on that unit would have been very, very high. And he would have said, it's not worth it to me. He would have moved out, and other people who valued that space more highly would have moved in. A family with a lot of people, or maybe 4 or 5 students would have moved into that unit. That would be more efficient. The space would be used in a way that was more valuable to the people who were there. But because the rent was kept down, he had the legal right to live there, and he had absolutely no incentive to leave. And so that's what he did. We would say this is inefficient because people who have a high willingness to pay can't buy as much housing as they want. Somebody who, like I said, a family that was willing to pay a high price to get that apartment, they had no way of expressing the value that they placed on that unit because they couldn't offer a higher price because the rent was controlled at at the earlier level. And he had a very low willingness to pay, but that didn't matter. He had a friend who had the legal right to that unit, and so he stayed there. Some cities have eliminated rent controls, but they still are used in a number of cities around the world. New York City has eliminated rent control in some areas, but in some areas it is still used. Also, sometimes it is changed to rent regulation, which means they don't just impose a ceiling and keep it at that level. Okay, we've already said that when you have a ceiling, the effects get worse and worse, and so often the way government responds to that is by saying, well, we'll make the effects not as severe by allowing the rent to change. One example would be that, or as it says here, they might be allowed to raise it by a certain percentage every year, or it could be that they are allowed to raise the rent whenever the renter leaves. So if you rent a property today, then sometimes the rent will be fixed at that level for as long as you're there. But then when you move out, then the landlord gets to charge a higher rent to the person who moves in, which is what I alluded to last time. I meant to scan this in, but you can see that here. This was from so New York Times 19, actually it was in the Natchitoches Times, but it came originally from New York, January of 8th, 1999, where a landlord was getting a really bad deal because he had these tenants who stayed in his unit for a very long time, so he was not able to raise the rent. He wanted them to leave so he could raise the rent, but they had a legal right to stay there at that lower level, and so he decided to kill them and paid someone to, or was about to pay someone to kill them before this was discovered. That's perfectly in line with the incentives that are created with rent control. Obviously, that was not the intention of rent control. But recognize when anytime you impose a price ceiling, you are changing the incentives. You are giving the producer less incentive, excuse me, to give the consumer what they want. When you have a free market, then if you're renting from a certain landlord, they have an incentive to make you happy. They want you to stay, because if you leave, that imposes cost on them. They have to find somebody new. But when you impose rent control, you're reducing that incentive that the producer has to make you happy, and the effects can be very, very unexpected. All right, an alternative to price controls. Economists, sometimes we make the mistake of simply pointing out the bad consequences of certain policies. It's good also to point out alternatives. The intention behind rent control is to help low-income people who are renting. Okay? And that's not inherently a bad thing to do. We need to recognize that anytime we try to help one group, there's going to be a cost that's going to be imposed on somebody else. Okay? But that's not inherently a bad thing to do. So what economics does, what it helps us with, is to look at any given policy and try to figure out what will the consequences actually be. That's what we've been doing But then we can also use economics to figure out what would be an alternative way to achieve the same goal. If we decide that we want to try to help low-income people who are renting, there is an alternative to price controls. Okay? We can use some type of voucher, which is a more efficient alternative. A voucher, if you're given a voucher for something, think of it as a piece of paper that entitles you to money if you spend it for a certain thing. You may have heard in regards to education, the government sometimes uses vouchers where you can, if you have a family that has low income, they want to send their children to a private school that's higher quality than the public school, then the government can give them a voucher. Let's say it's for $10,000. That would mean the government is giving that family $10,000, but only that it's $10,000 that can be used to purchase educational services for their child. Okay? So it's a way of increasing the purchasing power of whoever is receiving the voucher. So if we want to help low-income people who are renting apartments, we can give them a voucher for whatever amount of money we decide. So if you gave them a voucher for, say, $1,000 a month, that would mean you're giving them a piece of paper, which they can then take to a landlord, and it's the equivalent of $1,000 a month. It's clearly going to help those low-income people who receive the voucher, but it's not going to have the negative effect of creating a shortage. Okay? Now, there will be other consequences of having the voucher. Namely, there will be a cost to the other people in society, and you would need to, or you'd want to, look into what those consequences are. But it's not a clearly bad thing to do. Whereas with with rent control, it clearly has some very, very bad consequences, not just for landlords, but for the very people that that it's trying to help. So we would look at a price rent control and say it's a bad policy in the sense that it's inefficient, it hurts the producers, it hurts the consumers, it's hurting pretty much everybody. Okay? But often those rent control policies stay in effect for a long time because people don't realize the harmful effects that are occurring. The tenants, they see the quality going down, but they don't tie the falling quality to the rent control policy. They don't connect the dots and see how the cause and the effect are connected to each other. And that's one of the key things that economics tries to teach people, is to see things as effects that are the result of some cause. And if we can see those cause and effect relationships more clearly, then we can choose policies that will better achieve the goals that we have. All right, if anybody has a comment, feel free to throw it in. On the other hand, first we've been talking about price ceilings. Now other type of control is a price floor, which is a minimum price allowed by the government. It's where the government is telling producers, you can't charge less than a certain price. Okay? And just summarizing what the effects are going to be, and then we'll go through them individually. They create surpluses, lost gain from trade, which we've called deadweight loss, wasteful increases in quality. You might think, well, you know, how could it be bad to have higher quality? having higher quality can be a bad thing. If you're buying a car and you end up, you're looking at the economy version and the luxury version. Well, the luxury version has higher quality, but it comes with what? A higher price tag. In deciding what quality is best, is ideal, you look at what are benefits, what are the costs. We're going to see that with the price floors, you get increases in quality, but that's actually a bad thing because those increases come at a cost that exceeds the value of that higher quality. And then fourth, a misallocation of resources. Hold on just a second. Okay. Okay, this is just information about surpluses. We've already talked about generally a surplus of labor is called unemployment. And here we have the first example of a price floor. And most people don't spend a lot of time on a regular basis thinking about price ceilings and price floors. And so when you start to think about these things, you're probably going to have to, stop and say, okay, what, a ceiling, what is that? A floor? I would encourage you every time you see these terms, draw a graph, work through it in your mind, because the first time you work through it, it's likely to be tough. You're likely to make a mistake. Second time you work through it, it's not going to be quite as tough. You're less likely to make a mistake. The more you go through it, the easier it becomes, and the more you're less likely to make a mistake and confuse a shortage with a surplus and a ceiling with a floor. Very important to recognize that we're dealing with things that are very easy to confuse. But the more time you spend thinking about it, the less chance that you're going to make a mistake. Okay? So here we have typical graph, demand and supply. We're going to spend a while on this graph because if you're comfortable with, if you really understand this graph, then you shouldn't have too much trouble with a lot of the things we're going to do. What are we, remember one of the mistakes people make is they rush through looking at a graph and they skim over it, and after they've seen it, they really don't know anything that was there. So always when you see a graph, stop, slow down, take your time, and take in what's actually there. What does this say? Minimum wage creates a surplus. So what is this graph? Okay. Well, always look what's on each axis. On the vertical is the wage rate. Okay. On the horizontal is the quantity of labor. So we're talking about labor. Anytime we're dealing with supply and demand, we're talking about the supply and demand of something, some particular product. So here we're talking about labor, the demand for labor, the supply of labor. And we got the quantity on this axis, and we always have the price on the vertical axis. The wage rate is just the price of labor. So we are looking at a particular market here, the labor market, but it's really no different from other markets. You have a demand curve, you have a supply curve, you have an equilibrium price. And if the price is above that level, certain things will happen. And if the price is below that level, certain predictable things will happen. Okay? So as we go through things like this, try to see them as just another application of things we're already talking about. This is not something that's totally new. Okay? So we got the demand for labor. Stop and ask yourself, well, who demands labor? Who hires workers? And obviously that would be businesses. Think about, what does each point mean? Say that point, for example. Let's say that this is a particular a market for a particular skill level in a particular area. Let's say the market wage is, we'll say it is $9 an hour in this market. Okay, so read over to the demand curve and read down. Okay, let's say that that is 50,000 workers. Okay, what does that point on the demand curve tell you? It tells you two things. If the wage rate is $9, then businesses will want to hire 50,000 workers. That is the quantity demanded of this type worker. Okay? That's also a point on the supply of labor, which means that in this market, this particular point in time, if the wage rate is $9, then the quantity of workers who are willing to supply their labor is 50,000. So that $9 is going to be the equilibrium wage, in that if the wage rate is 9, the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied will be exactly equal. You've got 50,000 people who want to work at that wage. You've got employers who want to hire 50,000 workers. So you have a balance between the two. Okay? Now, as a footnote, let's recognize that in any real world market, you are always going to have some unemployment. Even if the wage is at the equilibrium level, you're always going to have some unemployment because things are constantly changing. Some consumers are changing what they want to buy. Workers are changing locations. They want to move to another city or something like that. And it takes time. Even though the quantities are in balance, it takes time for workers and employers to get matched up with each other. So if we had an economy like this, there would even at this equilibrium wage, there would, at any point in time, there would be some workers who have just lost their job, they haven't found a new job, and so you would still have some unemployment in that situation. But it would be short-term unemployment, people who are kind of between jobs. They haven't found, they've lost their job, they haven't found a new job. You would not have any long-term unemployment. Here, at the equilibrium wage rate, we're not going to have any long-term unemployment. What if, because we know that in the US, the minimum wage is $7.50 an hour. So with a minimum wage, of $7.50 an hour, what will the effect be? Somebody take a shot at it. Think about what a minimum wage of $7.50 does and what effect it will have in this market.
Looks like it would be close to a shortage.
Okay, let's think through this. At 750, we read over to the supply curve, and that gives us the quantity supply, okay, the amount of workers who are willing to supply their labor at that wage. And then to figure out what's going to happen, we always have to read over to the demand curve to see what the quantity demanded is going to be. Okay, so we see that you're going to have this many people who want, or this employers who want to hire this many workers. Let's say it's 80,000. And you're going to have this many people who are willing to work at that 750 wage. And let's say that is 40,000. Okay. Quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. What do we call that?
Shortage?
We call that a shortage. We got to be careful here. If the wage is $7.50 an hour, then we will have a shortage. But the important thing to see here is that if there is a minimum wage imposed of $7.50 an hour, that will not cause a shortage of labor. Let me say that again. If the wage is $7.50, then there will be a shortage. But if we impose a minimum wage law of $7.50, that will not cause a shortage. What do I mean by that?
Because that is the minimum price setting, and
$7.50. Well, think about what does a minimum wage law do. And this is really important to think carefully about. A minimum wage law of $7.50 does not tell producers you have to pay $7.50 an hour. It tells them you have to pay at least $7.50 an hour. Okay? It doesn't prevent them from paying more. So if the actual wage were $7.50, there would be a shortage. When you have a shortage, that causes the wage to go up. Okay? It would go up to $9, and we would end up in equilibrium. What you got to see is, the question you have to think about is, does a minimum wage law of $7.50 prevent the wage from going up to the equilibrium? And the answer is no, because employers will voluntarily choose to pay $9 an hour under these conditions. The minimum wage law specifies $7.50 as a minimum wage, but it doesn't require employers to pay $7.50. It requires them to pay at least $7.50. And under these conditions, employers will not pay $7.50. They're going to pay $9. Now you might think, well, if the minimum wage law is set, if the minimum wage is set at $7.50, why would they pay more than that? And the answer is simple. Employers like their workers and they want to help them out, right? No. Employers may like their workers, they may want to help them out, but that is not the reason that they're going to pay more than $7.50. Okay? They're going to pay more than $7.50 because if they only pay $7.50, they're not getting the workers that they want. They're not getting enough workers. So as employers compete for the workers who are available, it is in the employer's interest to offer a higher wage. Notice each employer is competing against all the other employers. So if they're charging $7.50 initially, you got some employers who can't hire as many people as they want, so they have an incentive to try to compete for some of those workers by offering a higher wage. Okay? So somebody starts offering $7.60 because they're trying to compete workers away from other firms that are offering less. And then that leads to somebody offering $7.70, $7.80. Competition between employers is what is going to ensure that these workers get a wage of $9 an hour. The workers can be confident that their wage rate is going to go up to the equilibrium level. And if the minimum wage is set below that equilibrium, then the minimum wage law has no effect at all. And there have been periods of time when the U.S. Minimum wage was below the equilibrium, and it really didn't have much effect. Okay? But let's think about, normally when we talk about a minimum wage, people are trying to get it raised to a level where it will have an effect. I saw a article in the paper just the other day. Genoa in Europe has just passed a law that, of course, they don't use dollars, but if you convert it into dollars, the minimum wage they're imposing is going to be $25 an hour. Okay? That is going to be an effective minimum wage, because I feel confident that's going to be above the market wage. So let's just assume that in Genoa, the market wage is right now is $9 an hour. They impose a $25 an hour minimum wage. Think carefully through what happens. Okay? The goal in doing something like this isn't just to see what the graph is going to look like. We use the graph to represent a complicated reality. And the graph helps us to see the very predictable consequences that will result. So when the government imposes the $25 minimum wage, that means the government is saying the price floor is now $25 an hour. So the government is saying to firms, you can pay workers $25 an hour, $26. You can pay them any wage you want. You pay them $100 if you want. The minimum wage is saying it is now illegal to pay them anything less. Okay. And why are minimum wages imposed? What's the intention? Well, it's to help low-income workers, right? That's the goal. At least that's the stated goal. But let's figure out, remember, intentions are not results. That's one of the things you want to, one of my favorite economists is David Henderson, and he repeats that over and over and over because people have such trouble remembering it. Intentions are not results. No doubt the minimum wage in Genoa was raised to $25 an hour with the intention of helping low-income workers. But to figure out what the consequences, the results will be, we use the graph, and the graph does not care about anybody's intentions. Okay? When the wage goes from $9 up to $25, how does that affect the willingness of people to supply labor? Okay? Well, when the wage was $9, here you had 50,000 workers who were willing to work, willing to supply their labor. When the minimum wage goes into effect, employers can no longer pay $9 an hour. That's now illegal. They cannot charge less than 25. And so the wage rate will be 25. And at that question?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Does that mean that's only the highest value, the people who have the highest value are going to be the only ones who can compete at that high level?
There is a point relevant to that, but let me hold off on that for just a minute. Okay, that's a good question, but let me get through this other thing first. At the wage is going to be $25 an hour. Okay, and what will happen to quantity supplied and quantity demanded? Well, at that $25 wage, reading over to the supply curve, we see the quantity supplied is very high. Maybe it's 100,000 workers. Okay? Doesn't mean you'll have that many people working. It means you have that many workers who look at the $25 an hour wage and say, sign me up, I want a job. They're willing to work. They're looking for a job. They're happy about the $25 per hour wage. Who's not happy about the high wage is the demanders of labor, who are now going to pay a very high price to get labor. So to determine how many jobs will be available, we look at the demand curve. And we see at the lower wage, there were going to be 50,000 jobs available. At the higher wage, the quantity demanded is going to be way back here. Let's say it's 30,000. Okay, so at a $25 wage, and these numbers are not, these are hypothetical. I'm not saying these represent the actual magnitudes, but given these numbers at the $25 per hour wage, you've got workers, you've got 100,000 workers willing to supply their labor. You've got 30,000 jobs. So this gap between the two is in previous examples, we taught that would be the surplus of this product. Here, when we're talking about labor, it's the surplus of labor. So that means you have that many unemployed workers, people willing to work, they can't find a job. Now, remember I said that when we're in equilibrium, you're always going to have some unemployed workers who are between jobs. They just haven't found a job yet. This unemployment is not people who haven't found a job yet. This is a surplus in the sense that there is not going to be a job for these people, okay? Because their value to an employer is less than the cost of hiring them. Think about it from the producer's perspective and the worker's perspective. If we talk to a worker, they say, "Oh, I really want a job. You know, I'd be willing." Maybe they say, "I'd be willing to work for $8 an hour, but I can't find a job." You talk to the employers, and they say, "Well, we'd love to hire more people, but we cannot hire anyone if we cannot hire anyone and pay them less than $25 an hour." So when they look at each person, they're thinking, is this person worth $25 an hour? And if they're not going to hire them. So let's say we bring together a typical worker and a typical business. The worker says, "Hire me." Business says, "I can't. I'd lose money on you." Worker says, "I'd be willing to accept, maybe $8 an hour." Employer says, "Wow, that would be great. I'd love to hire you and pay you, something close to $8 an hour. But the government won't let me do it. If I hire you, I have to pay you at least $25 an hour. And you're just not worth that much to me, so I cannot hire you. Worker says, but I'm willing to work for less. Employer says, sorry, that's not an option that the government gives me. Always remember, a minimum wage does not guarantee that anybody will receive that minimum wage. A minimum wage of $7.50 does not guarantee that anybody will receive $7.50 an hour. Now, think about what I mean by that. Okay? The minimum wage law does not guarantee any wage to everybody. What the minimum wage law does is guarantee that if you are hired, you will be paid at least that much. But the minimum wage law does not guarantee that anybody will get a job. If the minimum wage law guaranteed that everybody would be paid a certain amount, then, hey, let's have a minimum wage of $1,000 an hour. That would be great. If it guaranteed that everybody would get a job and would be paid that, then we'd all be rich. But the minimum wage law doesn't guarantee that you're going to get a job. Okay? And so in Genoa, by imposing the $25 minimum wage, that is not guaranteeing that every worker is going to get, everybody who wants a job will be paid $25 an hour. What it really does is guarantee that you're going to have a lot of unemployed workers. And the higher you raise the minimum wage, the more unemployed people you're going to have. Do some workers benefit from the minimum wage law? Yes. If we didn't, in this situation, without the minimum wage law, workers would be paid $9 an hour. With the $25 minimum wage, you are still going to have some people who are working, and they're going to be paid $25 an hour rather than $9. So it looks like some workers are going to benefit. That's not surprising. What people forget is that you're going to have a significant number of workers who are going to be hurt by the minimum wage law. And the higher the minimum wage is, the more workers who are going to be hurt by it. A lot of people in this country want a minimum wage of $15 an hour. Okay? Would that help some workers? Yes, probably it would. Okay? But it would, I don't think there's any doubt that it would cause unemployment to go up. And think about this. The people who are going to be hurt the most by a high minimum wage, okay? It's not going to be arbitrary, okay? Let's say that you're an employer who has an opening you're trying to fill, and 2 people apply for the job. One has just graduated from high school, doesn't have any experience, doesn't have any higher education, okay? No experience at all. You're not really sure how good a worker they're going to be. The other has a college degree, and they have a significant amount of job experience. Now, let's say that for the job you are trying to fill, both of those workers could do the job. Okay, they're both adequate to do it. Which one do you think you would hire?
The one with the most experience.
you're probably going to hire the one with the most experience rather than the one with less experience. So we've said that when you have a high minimum wage, that's going to create more unemployment, and the people who are unemployed are going to be the people who have relatively little education, the people who have relatively little work experience. They're going to tend to be people who, for various reasons, are already more likely to be discriminated against. Okay? So the people who suffer from a high minimum wage are going to be the people who already are at some kind of a disadvantage. The people who aren't likely to be hurt are the people with more education and more experience. So the adverse consequences of a high minimum wage are not just randomly distributed among the population. They're going to tend to have the most adverse effects on the people who already were suffering problems. But one more thing on that before we stop. There are a lot of jobs where a significant part of your compensation really comes from the experience that you get, because experience is very valuable. One of my favorite, my favorite economist is Thomas Sowell, and he tells the story of F.W. Woolworth, who was lived on a farm when he was growing up, and he worked from sun up to sundown 7 days a week. And he said, I don't like this. I don't want to do this all my life. So he goes to the general store owner and says, I'd like a job here. And the guy says, okay, I'll give you a job. You'll work from, pretty much sun up to sundown 5 days a week. And he says, great, how much are you going to pay me? And the answer was, pay you? I'm not going to pay you anything. You ought to be paying me for the value of all the experience you're going to get. Most people would say, forget this, I'm not going to take this job. But he saw that it would be very beneficial to him to work and get that experience. So he worked for a number of months, hours and hours and hours, and got no pay for it. And eventually, his employer did start to pay him. Okay? And the reason he started to pay him was because he knew if he didn't, that guy was going to go work for somebody else, which eventually he did. He started working for somebody else. He started making more money. He became a manager of a general store. He saved money. He started his own store. He figured out very effective ways of doing business. Eventually, he started a chain of stores, which you may not have heard of F.W. Woolworth, but that was the Sam Walton. He was the Sam Walton of an earlier generation. And when he incorporated, when he sold stock in his company, he became one of the wealthiest people in the world. When he sold stock in his company, he brought in that guy who gave him the job and didn't pay him anything. And he gave him stock in his company because he said, if you hadn't given me that unpaid job where I got all that experience, I wouldn't be where I am today. So he felt like he owed him a debt because of the benefit he had gotten from that initial job. And I've always remembered that don't look down on jobs that are not well paid, because you may be getting experience that will take you far beyond where you could have imagined. All right, we did not get finished with Chapter 8, but we're close. We'll finish Chapter 8 next time, and we will get started in Chapter 9 next time on international trade. And I said that Chapter 7 and Chapter 8 were two of my favorite chapters. Chapter 9 is great too. It's not as much of a favorite, but it is it's a very useful chapter, and it'll give you an appreciation for the benefits that we get from trading with other people in other countries. Any questions?
The portion that I missed, is that going to be available?
Yes, this is a recording. So so the recording should be available in an hour or so. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, I will, next Tuesday, my expectation is that we will be meeting again on campus as usual. But I will send you an email if it turns out that we will be doing it remote again. I'll let you know as soon as I know for sure. Have a good weekend and watch out for the storm.